Hello, everyone, and welcome to Alabama History in 20 Artifacts. I am very lucky that I get to begin us today in the 1820s. So we're going to begin our journey through 200 years of history with this portrait of General William McIntosh. Now, Marie Bankhead Owens, who served as the director of the archives from 1920 until 1955, called this portrait the most valued treasure of the archives and a gem of our collection. This impressive portrait, which stands at 7.5 feet high and 4.5 feet wide, is now a centerpiece in our Voices Gallery on the second floor. As I approach this talk, I realize there are two stories that I need to tell. The first is the story of the portrait itself, how it came to be at the archives. And the second story is of the portrait's subject, William McIntosh, who is quite possibly one of the most controversial figures in Creek history. This portrait was painted by Nathan Negus in 1821. He was an itinerant painter who came from Massachusetts to the southern states in order to make money fast by charging wealthy men an extravagant price for their portrait. One of the first wealthy men to pay that extravagant price was William McIntosh. It was completed in 1821, and after the portrait was completed, Nathan moved on to a new state, Alabama, where he lived for the rest of his life in Cahaba and Mobile, painting portraits until his death. But this portrait stayed with McIntosh, and he put it in his house near Lakwete. In 1832, years after McIntosh had already died, his son, Chili McIntosh, sold the portrait to a Georgia citizen named James Colvin. Now, Colvin took the portrait back to Columbus, to his tavern, where it would live for the next 60 years behind the cigar counter. The portrait could be seen by passers-by who dubbed it the Big Indian. One of those people was Peter Brannon, who would later become director of the Alabama Department of Archives and History. But when he was just a curator here at the archives, he encouraged Tom Owens and Marie Bankhead Owens to acquire the portrait for their collection. And in 1922, they were able to finally purchase it for $500. Now, once it came to the archives, it underwent extensive restoration in order to, get rid of that wear and tear of 100 years and 60 years of cigar smoke. And so now it continues to be a gem in our collection. Now, what about the man, though, in the portrait? Who is William McIntosh? Well, he was a Lower Creek leader who was born in the town of Lakwete, which is in Carroll County, Georgia. His father was Scottish, and his mother was a Creek woman of the Wind clan. Now, the Creek people were a matrilineal society. And in matrilineal society, they believe that your blood family are those who are related to you through your maternal line. The root of this idea is that a baby shares the same blood as their mother, and that blood is also shared by your maternal grandmother, aunts, uncles, cousins. So in Creek society, it is all about who your mother is. A child will inherit his or her mother's identity, their clan identity, their social position, and they'll be raised by their maternal family. Now, they understood that a father had a place in a child's life, but it was just not a dominant one. And even though his father had no real say in his upbringing, though McIntosh still was able to benefit from having his paternal connection to the United States. Indeed, his paternal cousin, George Troup, would eventually become the governor of Georgia. So he is a well-connected, wealthy man. But he was raised in Creek society. But this is a Creek world that has now been influenced by contact with Europeans. This can best be seen by his outfit. He pairs a European ruffled shirt and tie with traditional leggings and moccasins. His cloak is made from a patterned fabric imported from Europe, but fashioned in a traditional ceremonial cloak with a beaded sash and belt. Now, you can't see it here, but I really encourage you to go up into the gallery and to look closely at this portrait. Not only is it a great example of a talented painter, but you can see the details on this outfit. You can see the beadwork that was painstakingly done by a woman and his family to put together this outfit that shows the blending of European and Creek fashion and culture. Now, he supported an economic and a political alliance with the United States, and this included supporting the U.S. federal policy of civilization. This meant incorporating cotton farming, ranching, and the enslavement of African Americans. He did all of these things on his plantation near Lakwete. He became actively involved in Creek politics as early as 1805 in the Treaty of Washington, which ceded territory between the Oconee and Ocmulgee rivers and allowed for a federal road to cross Creek territory. After signing this treaty, he opened an inn at Indian Springs to accommodate American travelers. And that's actually where this portrait was taken. So behind him is supposed to be the beautiful countryside and landscape of Indian Springs. Now, of course, he was a part of many different treaties that ceded territory. The next important one is the Treaty of Indian Springs in 1821, where he ceded a large tract of land that both gave $200,000 to Creeks and $20,000 to him directly. So you can see here, the outline is what the Creek Nation was, the white here is what he ceded away, and the blue is what's left for them. So his supporters said he was being pragmatic. He was negotiating with a powerful nation, he was getting rid of debt, he was looking out maybe for the Creek people. His opponents said that he was selfish. He was taking something for himself. He was benefiting directly from this. And both are right. He was a very pragmatically selfish man. He is making these decisions in some ways because of pressure from the United States, but he is also benefiting directly from them. But after this treaty, the National Council, which is trying to centralize power, trying to protect Creek interests, makes a law. No individual chief, no group of chiefs can cede territory without the consent of the nation as a whole. And that means the National Council has to be involved. And McIntosh was actually instrumental in the passage of this law. To violate it means you will be executed. And yet 4 years later, he makes a second Treaty of Indian Springs, this time ceding 4.28 million acres, pretty much all of the territory left in Georgia, and he also added in 3 million acres into the new state of Alabama. Now, people were not very happy with this. He broke the law that he himself had been able to help pass. So what do? They execute him. On April 30th, 1825, more than 200 lawmenders surround his home at Indian Springs and light it on fire. As he fled the burning building, they all raised their guns and opened fire. His body was penetrated with roughly 200 bullets as they all were trying to exact justice. His wife sent this letter to her friends in the United States explaining what happened. This is a smear of his blood as proof of his execution. Now, she calls it his murder. A lot of people call it his murder, but it wasn't murder. It was an execution, lawfully acted out by the Creek National Council. Now, how does this fit into Alabama history? This is a Creek from Georgia, a painting by a man from Massachusetts. Why is this in our museum? Why is it here at the Symposium? Well, the Creeks who lived in Georgia and the Creeks who lived in Alabama were connected through cultural, political, and kinship ties. So the stories of the Creek belong to both states' histories. The portrait itself illustrates the cultural and economic changes Creeks faced in the 18th and 19th century. His outfit is the perfect example of that. And his story demonstrates the pressures Creek faced to cede territory. Indeed, because of his actions, the Creek territory was now limited within the boundaries of the state of Alabama. And this is where they would live until 1832 and removal. But lastly, and the point I want to leave you here with, this portrait's place in the Symposium, here at the beginning, reminds us all that the history of Alabama must always begin with the Creek people. Thank you.
This is the Aaron Evans storage jar. This is the way it looks upstairs. On the left is the way it looked when Margaret Ann Mulder Kelly found it at a farm on Weoka Creek about 25 years ago. And on the right is the way it looked after the Birmingham Museum of Art had an art restoration expert fix it so that it could travel in the traveling exhibit, Alabama Folk Pottery, about 10, 12 years ago. We attribute it to Aaron Evans. It is stamped AE. It could have been made by Aaron Evans. It could have been made by someone he hired as a potter. And it could have been made by an enslaved African-American potter. We're just not sure. Margaret Ann Mulder Kelly and her family have researched their family heritage of pottery making. They are not related to the Evans family, but they live close by, and their family settled and made pottery in what is Redland, Alabama, which is now Elmore County, was Montgomery County at one time. These are the things I want you to know about this jar. It's a storage jar, very important. It is stoneware, very durable, fired at 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit or so, almost to porcelain levels of firing. It has a deep south style of glaze called the alkaline glaze, which was developed right before the War of 1812 in the Edgefield district of South Carolina, far western South Carolina, closer to Augusta, Georgia than other main communities in South Carolina. And I want to just praise Margaret Ann, because it's people like her, Alabamians, who value their heritage and who gift things like the Aaron Evans jar to this institution that makes this such a great institution, and it benefits all of us as Alabamians. This is a storage jar. Storage jars, along with jugs and churns, were extremely important. If you wanted to make it, if you wanted to survive between growing seasons on the American frontier, you needed a storage jar. Now, when Margaret Ann found the AE jar, that E is not great, impressed very well. She was excited. She said, "Joey, I think I found an Andrew Duché pot," an 18th century Savannah River Valley potter, but as you can see, he marked this pretty clearly. This is a lead glazed storage jar. What she found instead was an alkaline glazed storage jar. This one made by David Drake and marked LM. Marked LM? Anyone have a guess? David Drake was an enslaved potter. At this time, his owner was Lewis Miles. In fact, David Drake is the most famous historic Southern potter because he wrote poetry on many of his pots. Storage jars, think canning jars, but on a bigger scale. The Aaron Evans jar is not that large. It's only about 2 gallons in capacity. This one here is probably about 6, this one about 20. They could not get a vacuum seal, so you had to salt, you had to smoke, candy, or pickle to make sure that your food is preserved. But having a durable jar that is watertight, and so glazed earthenware, like lead glazed earthenware, did that. But even at this time in the early 19th century, they were learning lead's dangerous. And these kind of glazed ware is much better for food preservation than the Indian and African tradition of unglazed earthenware. So stoneware was extremely important, and it could be made close by, so you didn't have to pay the cost of shipping these big, heavy things. Here's one of his poems. A literate, enslaved, African-American worker, but he wrote lots of poetry. Some of them have to do with the contents of the jar, some of them don't. Now, the alkaline glaze. It was developed in Edgefield County as we know it. The alkaline glaze is a Southern tradition. the context of the alkaline glaze is that Europeans, who makes the greatest ceramics in the world? The Asians. And the Europeans knew this. And in the 18th century, they really were trying, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, they were really trying to imitate Asian ceramics to make celadon. And one of the glaze formulas that the Asians uses an alkaline component, either wood ashes, lime, something as a flux to lower the melting temperature of silica. And somehow potters in Edgefield County started doing this. They were experimenting with it in the north. It just didn't catch on. But the man who really did this was Abner Landrum. Abner Landrum was kind of a Jeffersonian type figure. He owned the local newspaper. He had studied to be a doctor, but he decided he didn't want to be a doctor. And he became an inventor. He was the first. Most people think he was the first to graft native pecan onto hickory stock to help start the southern pecan growing industry. And he developed this industry in Edgefield using enslaved workers to make high-fired stoneware. And again, we're talking about 1810 here when he was doing this, where the Indians were still holding what is now Alabama and western Georgia. But the industry took off and did very well. And so all these trained potters, they were getting crowded. And as soon as that Indian land opened up, they surged westward. Here's some Edgefield wares. This is also where the southern tradition of the face jug, and that's a whole other story, and I cannot cover in 10 minutes. But here's Edgefield. Potteries. There was a little community called Pottersville. Lots of decoration, lots of competition, lots of potters crowded in there together. Free white potters, enslaved potters, pottery owners, sons of potters who wanted to go west to look for jobs, and this is what happened. And I like this map, even though the counties in Alabama are not exactly in the right place. This is from a book about Georgia pottery, and this shows kind of the 1820s expansion of the Edgefield diaspora of pottery that went all the way to the Guadalupe River Valley in central Texas, the westernmost valley of cotton agriculture in the Deep South prior to the Civil War. Each one of these little migrations, Indian land freed up. Move a few counties over. By the 1830s, surging into Alabama for newly opened Indian land. What this means in Alabama history is the first potters who worked below the mountains used this alkaline glaze. If you had lime as your flux, it looks more like this. Wood ashes, runny quote-unquote tobacco spit glaze. This is the salt glazing of Europeans, mid-Atlantic potters coming in this way, and Ohio Valley potters coming in north of the mountains. The tip of the spear, John Presley, Edgefield. In the 1820s, opens up a pottery. In 1829, sells it to Aaron Evans. Probably a relative, possibly a relative by marriage, almost certainly another Edgefield guy. We saw this version of this map earlier. He couldn't stop in here to make pottery, so he went on through to Montgomery, and this site is located in what is now Elmore County now, and not Autauga County. This is July 1829, Alabama Journal. He says, "I'll mark my pottery AE," thus the attribution. Who was John Presley, though, the guy who sold him the pottery? He was Abner Landrum's father-in-law. The father of Edgefield pottery, this was his dad. His father-in-law, his wife's dad. And you see he's a little bit older. And he's kind of an older guy going out, in his 50s. In early 19th century years, 50s was, you're getting on up there. This is them living next door to one another in 1820 Edgefield. Of course, by 1830, Presley and Aaron Evans are in this part of Alabama. Here's the only other AE impress jar we know about. The E is more pronounced, and there's an L there. Probably a Landrum, maybe a younger man working for Aaron Evans. maybe a free man of color, who knows? Margaret Ann Kelly found this site for me, this archaeological site, and I wasn't going to leave there until I found a marked shard. And I found a marked E, but it wasn't the same E. But this is a punctated E, and this might have been a mark he made before he actually crafted a stamp. And there are some unmarked pieces that we have attributed to this site as well. Evans dies in 37, probably from a contagion. He was a young man. He was born in the first century of the first decade of the 19th century. The next generation were John Presley's son. John Presley's son, Evans, and John Edward something Presley. This is John Edward and his wife, Mary Ann. Didn't stay here. Went to Mississippi, went to Winston County, Mississippi. But this is what their pottery looked like. We know because this is early pottery from central Alabama that wasn't made by the molders by a process of elimination. You get your clues where you can find them. So Mike McIntosh has one of the greatest collections of American stereo views and the definitive Alabama collection. He lives in Montana, but he recently found this stereo view, 1870, by Lakin, a Montgomery photographer. I guess he was making a stereo view of cotton for a northern audience. I mean, I don't get it, I don't think it's a still life. However, what we're interested in, of course, is the fence, the tantalizing corner of a piece of furniture, and of course this jug, which is identical to these, what I think are Evans Presley jugs here. And well, I'm not going to go into it, but there are certain attributes that make this. But this jug was probably 20 to 30 years old when it was photographed in 1870. The jar puts Alabama in context of this Edgefield alkaline glaze diaspora. We're in like the middle of the going to Texas movement, right? And the poster child, and so these are Alabama potters who went to Texas or were trying to go to Texas from Edgefield. And the Rushtons, Prothero, Allen, Duncan, they made this ash glazed stoneware. But when the Indians left, more often than not, Edgefield potters would stop in Randolph County. The land was cheaper. There was a gold rush going on. They established rock mills. This is the Abram Mordecai jug, by the way, that Peter Brandon wrote about in Alabama Historical Quarterly. Beautiful jug owned by Montgomery County Historical, but it was made in Randolph County. Randolph County celebrated its bicentennial by having 2 historic markers for potteries in the state that they erected last year. And one in front of this shop, same shop, 20 years apart, still standing. And the poster child for this gone to Texas movement were the Rushtons. The Rushton family, great potters out of Edgefield, lived and made pottery in Randolph County in a little town called Cedric. Cedric named after Ivanhoe's father. The only thing left in Cedric, Joseph Rushton and his wife Martha's grave, and 4 pottery sites, archaeological pottery sites, that had marks like this: JR for Joseph Rushton, SR for Cyrilda Rushton, his sister-in-law, and this was probably made by an enslaved potter she owned, and thus this value of this pot belonged to her. Joseph's brother, Bennett Jackson Rushton, did make it to Texas. And Bennett Jackson Rushton, this is an Alabama mark from Cedric. This is his grave, though. He went to Texas, but he didn't stay there. He came back. Not all the way to Alabama, but to Neshoba County, Mississippi, where he was killed during the Civil War. He should have stayed in Texas. He was killed not by Matthew McConaughey, but by Newton Knight, who Matthew McConaughey portrayed in the Free State of Winston, or at least by Newton Knight's men. And a famous incident that's well recorded where they, I guess, were going to destroy his pottery in Neshoba County. But anyway. But more Rushtons went, including Joseph Rushton's son, Joseph Clifford. Everybody called him Clifford because Dad was named Joseph. is Texas mark, Rusk County, Texas. And so this is kind of Alabama was a great, place to land, stay for about a generation, push on to Texas, but not everyone did that. The Mulder family stayed, continued to make pottery almost for 100 years, up until World War II, in Redland. Made beautiful pottery, alkaline glaze pottery, like this. This is the second generation of Mulders working in Redland, getting ready to take pottery to market, and the Boggs family. The Boggs family came also from Randolph County to Montgomery County, and here is Kelly Fitzpatrick's one of many studies of the Boggs pottery. And Bo Boggs still makes pottery, although he makes most of his money making cabinets in this shop. He's taught all of his kids and nieces and nephews how to make pottery in the old family tradition. That's the Aaron Evans jar. Thank you.
When the workmen in Daniel Pratt's cotton gin factory made this cotton gin, Alabama was rebounding from the devastating panic of 1837. It was on its way, the state was on its way to become, in 1850, the largest cotton producer in the country and the largest cotton gin maker in the world. The cotton gin cotton was a signature crop of the 19th century, and the cotton gin was the signature machine. The gin was the site of invention and innovation, and it was a marker of industrialism. The gin, as we all know, of course, is the engine, or gin for short, that removes the fiber, the very fine, fragile fiber from a cotton seed. The ideal gin removes the full length of that fiber, and at the same time, it cleans it, removing the seed, the seed, but also the dirt and the leaves that are collected when the cotton is picked. It produces clean cotton, at least ideally. This is a precision machine that's supposed to deliver that high-quality cotton in large quantities. But it was well known, well before the 40s, that the saw gin fell far short of that ideal. Yes, it delivered large quantities, but it cut the already short cotton fibers into even shorter pieces. That meant that the quality of cotton was lowered, and that meant that planters received lower prices for that cotton. And planters were already reeling and suffering from the depressed prices of the panic. So it was around the 1830s, planters made demands. They demanded improved saw gins or entirely different machines to process their market crop. Mechanics and inventors answered. They answered with patented improvements, incremental improvements, little tiny improvements to the saw gin, different ways of making the teeth, different modifications of the hopper, different little tweaks to the saw gin. But they also responded with two radically different types of machines. And both of these processes occurred in Alabama in the 1840s. Pratt bragged that he made cheap, fast gins, farm gins, like this very unembellished gin that we have here. It's a 40 saw gin. You'll see it on display. It's a little small for a plantation, but just the right size for a small farm cotton crop. These were his pot boilers, I call them, but it wasn't the only thing that he built. Pratt actually embraced and incorporated into the gins that he made his more upscale gins, his larger gins. He incorporated those patented improvements. He didn't have to buy a patent. He bought the pieces and the technology and incorporated them in his saw gins. But more significantly, he invested in one of the two radical new types of gins. And I think it's remarkable, really, on a certain level, that he invested in and built the most complicated, or the more complicated of the two gins. What he invested in was something called the cylinder gin. And for people who know the textile industry, it resembled a carding engine like that you would find in either a cotton or a woolen spinning mill. They're these huge drums that are covered with fine teeth, and they were designed to sort of brush off the fiber from the seed, thereby preserving that full length, that staple length. Farmers, I should say planters, they were very expensive, and so only the largest planters could afford them. But Pratt's investment and commitment to that gin actually severed his relationship with one of his patrons, Samuel Griswold, for those of you who know a little bit of that history. But he was committed to change as much as Daniel Pratt, as much as he was committed to the tradition of these standard gins. But it was something called the McCarthy gin that made the biggest impact in the cotton industry in the 1840s. This was the second radical departure. A man by the name of Phones McCarthy relocated from upstate New York to Demopolis, Alabama, and he did that in the early 40s for the sole purpose of patenting a gin in Alabama, having the state of Alabama's on his patent. And he also produced it in Demopolis and surrounding areas, built it. And the McCarthy gin delivered, it promised and it also delivered the very highest quality cotton, longest staple, cleanest fiber. The McCarthy gin, and they're still in use today, but you won't see them around here. You'll see them in California or New Mexico, where they grow a different type of cotton. But it's a roller gin that he conceived of and patented and built. Large roller, one large roller with a reciprocating blade that sort of knocked the seed off the fiber. It moves so quickly you can't really see it, but it reciprocates and knocks. It's just a completely different idea of ginning cotton. Planters embraced the McCarthy gin. They wrote these just stunning testimonials saying that the saw gin was just doomed and gone, and everyone was going to move to the McCarthy gin. Despite the quality, though, that it delivered, it never matched the quantity. And in the short staple cotton market, that was premier. So the McCarthy gin eventually and incrementally moves out of the larger short staple cotton market and into the long staple sector, the type of cotton that's grown today in the West. Again, where quality is far more important than quantity. So in the 1840s, there was not one cotton gin. There were actually three: the saw gin, the cylinder gin, which did hang around for quite a while, and the McCarthy gin. In nearly every county seat in the state of Alabama by the mid-40s, there was at least one cotton gin shop or cotton gin factory, however large or small. Who worked there was as remarkable as what they made. On the shop floor and in the workbench, white mechanics worked alongside enslaved and free black mechanics. This was the case in Daniel Pratt's cotton gin factory and foundry. He had a relative, George Smith, and his I think it was his brother, Ferdinand Smith. Both were diarists. George was the initial diarist, and then he shamed his relative into also becoming a diarist. But it was George who described daily and in sometimes gruesome detail, but certainly fastidious detail, just that the setting, the day-to-day operations of Pratt's factory, and he documented that interaction of waged free black workers as well as waged enslaved mechanics. That was the case in Pratt's facility and across the southern industrial landscape. So what does this humble farm gin tell us about life in Alabama in the 1840s? I think it tells us that Alabama then was a technologically dynamic place, and that black and white, enslaved and free men fueled that dynamism. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm just freezing. Really, thank you. Okay, my name is Lecia Brooks, and I'm with the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I spent a bit of time at the Equal Justice Initiative, and that's why I learned what I'm going to share with you today about this artifact, the slave collar. And I'm so grateful that this is called the Department of Archives and History, because unlike the previous presenters, which was just fascinating, you all know about archives, I'm going to share a little bit about history, okay? Unless the piece and how it fits into history. It's also very interesting to sit and hear about the contributions of enslaved people to Alabama without really talking about enslavement in Alabama. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. So the enslavement, I think just to be clear, because one could get the impression that, wow, enslaved people made pottery, enslaved people made the gin. Sounds like it was an okay system. And that would be wrong. So it's important to understand the enslavement of black people in the South was something that was widely embraced. And to be clear, enslavement is owning other human beings, right? Whether or not people were allowed to practice their talent and contribute historical artifacts or contribute through their artistry, people were still owned. So I want to make sure that we understand that. It was embraced by political leaders, by clergy, by regular folk. And by regular folk, I mean people who had the means to own other human beings or not. So whether or not people were actually slaveholders themselves, the system of American slavery was embraced broadly. In the South, this particular peculiar institution persisted for decades beyond the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. And to be clear, the enslavement, American slavery was characterized by daily brutality, cruelty, and dehumanization. So it's particularly, it's that dissonance that allows me to appreciate the contributions through pieces, through the cotton gin and through the pottery, the pieces of pottery that we've seen today, and then kind of reconcile that it was this overall system of brutality. So I think that that's interesting to think about. The slaveholder had absolute authority over the enslaved person. Absolute authority over men, women, and children. People were legally recognized as property. Between 1808 and 1860, the enslaved population of Alabama grew from less than 40,000 to more than 435,000. Alabama had one of the largest slave populations in the United States at the start of the Civil War. During the 1840s, slave traders shipped thousands of enslaved people from the upper South to the lower South, Alabama, via steamboat and railroads that were laid by enslaved people. Prior to that, enslaved people were marched by foot from the upper South to the lower South. Hundreds of enslaved people arrived in Montgomery daily, making the city the principal slave trading center in Alabama. Montgomery had the largest slave population that was larger than Mobile, New Orleans, and Natchez, Mississippi. And that is completely connected to what we heard from the earlier speaker. Alabama was the top cotton producer. In 1833, and I found this curious, in 1833, the legislature the legislature banned free black people from residing in Alabama, which is curious to me. When we talk about free blacks, it didn't reconcile with the law. So black people were banned from free black people were banned from residing in Alabama, and enslavement was truly the only legally authorized status for black people within the state. The slave collar then becomes even more important. And this particular piece, which you'll find upstairs, is gorgeous, right? And as I was doing a little bit of research on slave collars, I saw contemporary versions of it in a choker. And I used to wear chokers in the 60s. I'm like, wow, I had no idea it was connected to the slave collar. The slave collar was used to identify people as property. So it's not jewelry. It's not meant to adorn the person or to denote any particular status other than them being owned. The slave collar was used as a kind of a pass. And if you think about apartheid South Africa and black South Africans having to produce a pass when stopped, this served a similar purpose. So if someone had a collar on, then authorities or anyone really knew that they were owned and they were authorized to go to and from a certain place. They were out on official business, not out for pleasure, but out for the slaveholder's benefit. The enslaved person did receive some measure of protection when they had the slave collar on, because then they weren't mistaken as runaways, so they wouldn't be attacked or beaten or taken. Now, someone who wore this particular type of slave collar was someone who was considered not to be at risk of running away. There were other more elaborate slave collars that were used for people who had been known to run away in the past. And those are not these attractive pieces of jewelry, but really just awful pieces of iron and spikes sticking out over their heads. So they were easily identified as people who might run away. But not the case here. It also, this collar denotes the wealth of the owner, right? William King, whose collection this came from, this tells us that he was a man of wealth. Also, in the documents that the archive shared with me prior to this morning's presentation, had all these things that he donated, the slave collar being one of them, but it was his last will and testament, and it talked about his bequests. So we also know that he was wealthy because he bequeathed his plantation that was in Lowndes County to his sister, I thought it was interesting that he made a point of not giving it away until after the planting season was done. He also bequeathed his slaves, who are referred to as Negroes in these documents, 65 Negroes to his nephew, 30 Negroes to his grandniece, who he referred to as my tiny niece or something, which made me believe that she was very young, but she received 30 Negroes to another niece, 10 to a nephew, 10 to another niece, 10 to another niece that was in Louisiana. And it's also important to note that he granted his quote-unquote manservant passage to any free state. So when we look at the slave collar, I want us to kind of remember that history, right? And most importantly, to remember the institution of slavery. And thanks to this opportunity to be able to talk about it for a little bit today, I'll probably never wear a choker again. So thank you.
Morning, everyone. Honored to be a part of this program. Really interesting presentations. When I was asked to be a part, I was given this, which is a finial of carving of the Roman goddess of wisdom and learning and the arts that once stood atop Union Female College in Eufaula, Alabama. And of course, I was asked what the other presenters are asked to do is explain how this addresses in some way life in Alabama in the decade of the 1860s. And when I realized that, yes, the 1860s are that time period which features that cataclysmic event that really is a big landmark event in Alabama national history. And I used to live in Eufaula or work in Eufaula and written a lot about it. I couldn't help but attempt to go a step further to explain both what it meant and to help understand this item as a window to a broader experience, because I believe Eufaula Civil War experience is one that represents something that a large portion of the state, not everybody, but a large portion of the state shared and could relate to. So if you understand it, you probably understand a good bit of the war. So we'll move fast, but in the next 7 to 8 minutes, I hope I can share some of that with you. And Joey's only got me beat by one slide, so we'll get through 19. If we could get through his 20, we'll go through my 19. So it's a figural carving of the Roman goddess. It's made with exceptional level of craftsmanship. It was a major endeavor to do something like this. And it was the institution that it set atop, and I think you can barely see it sitting up there. Union Female College was a union of several local civic organizations that banded together to create this, which was a pretty massive edifice, a substantial undertaking, done at a time when there was no really effective system of public education in Alabama. All education was effectively private, and especially higher education, for women. So it was a collaboration that required a lot of resources, a definite vision, and a definite reason that for the appreciation of education that is simply something that did not happen everywhere. Not everybody could pull off something like this. Not everybody was dedicated to an idea like this. Now, they would have taught a classical curriculum focusing on poetry, literature, music. It's more in the line of what you'd call a finishing school, in that it was not education for some practical utilitarian purpose to go out and get a job. This was a facility for the education of certain women of a certain status, a certain class, certain wealth, to attain the highest degrees of cultural refinement as it was understood at the day for the white population. And this was a society that this was designed in that obviously had a lot of influence, really glorified ancient civilizations, Greek and Roman. We know about the architecture, but they were in there. It was mark of education and refinement to know Latin and to appreciate the arts, and so they looked backwards as much as forward at the time period. And even though women may have been relegated to the domestic sphere, the certain class would have been expected to do more than know how to keep a home, and this was supposed to help prepare them for that role. Now, as I mentioned, this school required a significant financial investment, and it's the type of thing that did not just occur anywhere. Now, Barber County at the time, which is where Eufaula is located, was the 6th largest county in Alabama. It was only about 10 or 12 people from being the 5th largest. So we think of Eufaula today, if we know anything about Eufaula, as a small, quaint, historic southern town that's sort of off the beaten path. At the time, though, Eufaula sat in the middle of one of the most wealthiest, politically powerful and wealthiest regions of the state in the South, of course, fueled by the institution of slavery and the money that all that generated. But the Black Belt was the epicenter of power, political power, economic power at the time, and Eufaula was very much a part of that. There was a port city, had a lot of important political figures from the region. As a matter of fact, Eufaula had been really, in one way or another, at the very epicenter of the whole movement towards secession. There was a group there that had been working as early as the 1840s. Some of the earliest advocates of the idea of a separate Southern nation were coming out of Eufaula all the way back in the 1840s. And they kind of took over the local newspaper, the Eufaula Democrat, and called it the Spirit of the South in 1850. And if you can read that masthead, it says equality in the Union or independence out of it. And that's 1850. So these guys, there was a group of them that were really pushing for this, and they were putting their money where their mouth was. Jefferson Buford sold some of his own slaves to finance an expedition to take settlers to settle the Kansas territory so it could become a pro-slavery state. He tried to get them up there, paid their passage, and supplied them for a whole year. So they were serious about this. And this is Henry D. Clayton from the neighboring town of Clayton, Alabama, right outside of Eufaula. Looks like he's going off to war. He's going off to this Kansas expedition in the 1850s. And these guys were very convinced that not only was slavery and the institution that enabled their wealth at stake, but their entire worldview and the society of which they thought was very much in danger. Now, not everybody in Eufaula, of course, sided with them, but they did have some political power. And when Alabama seceded, of course, the governor of the state was a member of this Regency group. So Eufaula is part and parcel of this whole effort to establish a separate Southern nation. Now, what's this got to do with Minerva? Well, Minerva sits atop an institution that in some ways an embodiment of some of the ideals that society aspires to, and it tries to press on during the war. Even though the war is raging all around it, Eufaula's not on the front lines for a long time. But this is Molly Hyatt, who attended the school. She left a brief diary. I've gotten the privilege of seeing a few of the passages from. I used in a book on the Civil War experience of Eufaula. And she talks about the fact, the celebrations of secession going on. She talks about some of the students knitting scarves and sent to the troops in Virginia. So notice she took geography of the Confederate States, not the United States, all that as the war is going on. And the point is that the war kind of consumed everything in Southern society, whether they wanted it to or not. There was scarcity of everything from salt to shoes to soap, the blockade. All these things are playing a daily part of the daily operation of the school during the 1860s, and it affected everybody, no matter your status. Now, very few people like Wallace Comer sent a body servant with him when he went off to war, but white or black, everybody was aware of the progress of the war in one way or another and were affected by it in one way or another. There were local militias raised. There were slaves were impressed to do labor on fortifications. That's an impressment receipt near Eufaula. Eufaula actually even dabbled a little bit in industrial development by having a local ironworks that helped fabricate parts for some of the steamboats, the ironclads being built up in Columbus, Georgia. Now, when the war finally did, in a military fashion, actually reach Eufaula's doorstep, it did so through a raid by Benjamin Grierson, one of the last major cavalry campaigns in the war. A prong of his force had gone out and had actually captured Alabama's sitting governor, Thomas Hill Watts. Grierson arrives on the scene. This is late April 1865. Appomattox has happened. Lincoln's been assassinated. The war is effectively over, but nonetheless, the townspeople come out and beg him under a flag of truce not to destroy the town. And this scene that is familiar, that sort of a story that you've heard about in other places, plays out right under Minerva's gaze, right there on College Hill. And as he descends into the town, going down into downtown, past the college, his troops file right past the college, he is serenaded by a musician who taught some of these young ladies at Union Female College playing Dixie, defiant to the end. He gets into Eufaula, and he discovers that some of the machinery for state government, remember, Montgomery had just been captured. They're trying to send some of the archives looking for offices to try to set up a temporary government facility in Eufaula, of all places. The government is on the run. This is the very end of the war. It never really developed completely that way, but so Eufaula was a pivotal part of this whole movement towards secession and the ideals that were embodied there. And then it played a small role in this little ignominious end in some ways. Now, it goes without saying, we don't have time to talk about in 2 or 3 minutes the significance of what this meant to the enslaved, who this was the moment of jubilation. This is emancipation in reality. This is not an idea. This is a moment that they're looking at a new feature that's uncertain, but definitely brighter. For the white population that had aided and abetted the war effort, and most in Eufaula did, that wasn't the case everywhere in Alabama. But they're left with trying to reckon with what had happened. The entire civilization that they knew, their entire worldview had been turned completely upside down. Thousands of men killed, and the ones that came back home, like Leonard Dean, several of them maimed, as it was a perpetual reminder, mentally, physically, emotionally, that they had been through a devastating destruction, and they struggled for how to deal with that for a long time. I would imagine that later on in our presentations we might hear some bits and pieces of what some of those responses ultimately were. But the point I want to make in closing is that if you go to Eufaula today, there's a wonderful tour of homes. I'm not going to say anything negative about that. It's wonderful to appreciate the architecture and these relics of this time period. It's not designed, in most things that we look at when we're evaluating and trying to understand history, are not necessarily designed as a deep, thought-provoking exercise, and you won't learn necessarily about the slave craftsmanship and all the foundations of Southern society at the time. If you go to these homes, you sort of appreciate little bits and pieces of an era, and those bits and pieces sometimes make us think that we can reduce the era to a very simple understanding. And the truth is, if you look at things like Minerva, you study why they were made, how they were made, what they witnessed, it opens up a much more complex series of understandings of the time period of which they're made, and every era is unique to itself. There's certainly some continuity in Alabama history, but I would argue that we can never truly understand exactly what life was like in those previous eras, and this is a reminder of a previous era. Thank you.
I'd like to invite all the speakers from session 1 back up to the stage for some Q&A.
So we are recording, so we ask that you wait until on time so you see your question. Who's first?
I had a question for Joey Brackner. What was the significance of going to Texas to make pottery? Was it a huge pottery center?
No, well, it became there were pottery centers in every state in the Union, really, and in the South. And no, it was more about the frontier moving on, the lure of cheaper land, undeveloped land. And, some people got to Texas, they were disappointed, but most stayed. And so, gone to Texas was a thing. You stayed a few years or maybe a generation, and then people moved on. It was just the way the country was moving, especially at this latitude.
Ms. Brooks,
Oh, yes. Okay.
the collar was absolutely beautiful. Was it gold? I have not seen it upstairs, so I mean.
It didn't say in the paper, so I don't know. Is it? Oh my gosh, yes.
Was that common?
Common? No. It really was about wealth. So the greater your wealth, they were also iron. There were some just plain iron, and then some silver and some gold.
Okay, so Mr. King, slaves, if they went places for him, did the majority of them have, or is it just one they traded out?
No, the difference between kind of the more decorative collar that we saw and then the more restrictive ones had more to do with how the safety of the slaveholder's property. He had plenty of collars, right? So if you were to be trusted, then you would get one of the nicer collars. I don't know how he determined who had gold or who had iron.
Thank you.
My question was basically the same thing about the collar and then perhaps the craftsmanship. I mean, it was a beautiful piece.
I know, and I wonder if enslaved people made them. I don't know. So thanks for this opportunity, because I'm going to do more study.
About Eufaula.
Okay.
Why did they not burn the town? And also, why did more governors from Alabama come out of Eufaula?
The first question, why they not burn the town? Grierson entered Eufaula April 29th, 1865. It was very clear all the major Confederate armies had or were in the process of laying down their arms. Grierson had no intention to launch some sort of raid in the way that Sherman's raid, this type of thing, meant as a war measure. He's simply doing a mop-up operation to eliminate any other pockets of resistance and really join up with other forces, which will very soon be looking for Jefferson Davis. So it's not that he is on the war path so much as eliminating any other potential Confederate resistance. And one of the main other things he was doing was he sent a detachment to capture Alabama's sitting governor. Now, what was the other question about the governors?
Why did more governors of Alabama come out of Eufaula?
Eufaula was a prominent political and relatively wealthy, modest-sized town on a port. And for all those reasons, it was a pretty important political center for a long time. Remember, the Black Belt was Alabama's epicenter for power for a long time. Eufaula was at the far fringe of that, but Eufaula was a pretty important place at the time. As I said in the beginning, today Eufaula stands entirely in a different situation in the rest of the state. But at the time, Eufaula was a major town and was one of the most prominent political centers in the state. It had been very active for decades.
This question is for Dr. Colvin. What's the bridge between McIntosh helping this legislation go forward and then violating it to the point of his execution? Is there some explanation for, was he just filled with hubris, or?
That's pretty much what historians kind of believe. In some ways, he might have seen himself as above the law. He is one of those characters, the historical characters, who it's hard to figure out what his motivation was or what his thinking was. There were a few other chiefs who signed it with him, but he was the head person who was in charge of negotiating that treaty. And everyone questions, if you were instrumental in getting this law passed, why would you then break it? And I think it's because he truly thought they wouldn't come for him. He had a large enough, clan affiliation. The Wynn clan's one of the most powerful clans in the Creek Nation. I think he thought that would buy him protection. And ultimately they decided, because there were Wynn clan members who were there, who were part of the execution, and other clans who all united together. So I think ultimately they answered the question for him that he was not above the law.
Ms. Angela, the cotton gin, supposedly Lakwete, developed, this one was developed here. Did it become a bigger machine, or is this a hand-turning machine on the plantations? Or?
I think that none of the gins were hand-turned. They were turned by animals. We had one at Westville that was a mule turn, so it was a horse or a mule or oxen. But even in the late 18th century, there were steam-powered roller gins, even before Whitney patented. He didn't invent, but patented his machine. So there were many ways of powering the machines. And generally, there were hand-operated machines, but not in, I didn't talk about any of the ones that were actually hand or foot powered. That's a whole other category of machine that I think weren't actually used in Alabama during our period. So
The smaller farmers then would have carried their cotton to the gin like we did here?
they would have, you know, a very small farmer would use his neighbor's gin. They weren't organized cooperatively like they were in the 20th century, but yes, they would. The smaller farmer would take their cotton to a planter's gin, let's say, and have it processed there if they couldn't afford their own small gin. Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Brackner, regarding the pottery, the map of the potters moving with the frontier, moving westward, you mentioned John Presley moving and going into Mississippi. Do you know if...
No. No. According to the family, this is not Elvis's family. I think that Elvis's family may have come through Kentucky, perhaps. But I want to take the moment, you know, we're talking about folks that who sometimes we don't know who made these things. And I meant to say, but I was rushing through my the jug, the three identical jugs that I showed, the two that are still in existence and the one from the 1870 photograph, if we're right and those were made at Evans Presley's pottery in Cusata, those were probably either made by Jasper Roy, who was a white potter who worked for wages before the Civil War and then worked for wages for Evans Presley after the Civil War, or Edmund Presley, who was a potter, an enslaved potter before emancipation and continued to work for fewer wages based on information from other potteries that I know about after the war. And that's how we know his name and the fact that he lists in 1870 his occupation still as potter.
Ms. Brooks, I was wondering, I know it can be difficult for African Americans to trace their ancestry and heritage throughout this period. I was wondering if you could give us some clue or idea of what's the status of that in Alabama, what the archives or other institutions are doing what do we know about which slaves were here and their positions and things like that?
I'll have to leave that question to Dr. Colvin, because I have no idea. I'm not connected that intimately. Maybe Mr. Murray knows also, but I don't. But if I might ask you a question, Dr. Colvin, related to the portrait. So after he was executed, was his family able to keep the money? Or what did they do? What happened with his wealth?
For his personal wealth, they were able to keep that. I don't know if he was ever paid the money from the Treaty of Indian Springs, because this is actually something I couldn't get into, but the very next year they make a Treaty of Washington in 1826, and it repealed the Treaty of Indian Springs. Now, and it's one of the only times that really happens where the United States says, yeah, maybe that was a bad idea. But they did still keep that land cession in Georgia. They gave them back the 3 million acres in Alabama, and then a whole different group of people got money for that. It's a whole different delegation who got some money for that. But I don't actually know if Chile or his other children or his wives or his maternal family, I don't know who got the money directly, but I do know that a huge contingent of them, and a part of the Treaty of Washington, was to allow McIntosh and others Chile McIntosh and others to go to Oklahoma or Indian Territory. And they were paid money to be able to get supplies. They were given land in this Indian Territory. And so they are some of the first Creek people to remove to Indian Territory in the 1820s.
Yes, so a great question about the genealogy of African Americans and some important work that's happened here previously. One of our former employees, Fraisine Taylor, authored a very important book on doing African American genealogy in Alabama and the South. It came out several years ago. And she remains a very active consultant and teacher on that subject and was here just last week conducting as part of a site visit during a conference that took place here in Montgomery on African American genealogy. There's a couple of very specific things that have happened that have been extremely important advances in that work. One happened, one of our earliest and most significant digitization projects here at the archives years ago was to scan the voter registration books from 1868 when Alabama was required to write a new state constitution, 1867, that year as part of Reconstruction and Alabama's readmission to the Union. There was a statewide registry of eligible voters made, and that, we believe, that document is really the first state record to include the names of many African American men who were eligible to vote for the first time then. That material is all online and searchable in a database and is one of our most important genealogical tools for that. We've just recently, and I should say, we're also looking, having recently acquired some new equipment that allows us to contemplate this. We may be rescanning those books to get better images. Technology has improved dramatically in the last 15 years, and we're looking at the possibility of doing that in the next year or so. We also very recently came across a series of 1875 voter registration books that we didn't even know exist. I don't know, Ed, if this was familiar to you, but they were one of these sets of records that are cataloged under a title that was not completely self-evident or indicative of what we had, and we've come across these, and these are going to be additional, very important, I think, genealogical resources for us, and those have bumped up on our priority list. Further out, and something that would be very ambitious, but we're interested in pursuing, is a statewide effort to do some indexing in a variety of types of records looking for the names of enslaved people. And this is a project that has been, this type of project has been undertaken in some other states. Maryland has been working on this for 18 years now. It's one of the projects that we're taking a look at. It would be a lengthy and difficult project to undertake because of the variety of types of records that we would be examining. So it's everything from manuscripts to state records to estate files to estate inventories, runaway ads, a whole variety of things. But that is on our list of projects that we're contemplating over the next couple of years as we get past the Bicentennial and some other anniversaries that are coming up, something that we want to do. And new technology that's newly available to us to support crowdsourcing will make this work much better, where you can actually participate in this type of project. That's something that we now have that was undertaken here with our World War I digitization project last year. So we're looking forward to being able to bring you some updates on that front in the next couple of years.
This is just a question for Dr. Brackner. I was looking at all of your movements of pottery. Was that determined by the availability of certain materials?
Oh, that's a good question, and thank you for the doctorate, by the way. I appreciate that. I'll accept it. No, yes, you can't make pottery without good pottery clay. Luckily for the state of Alabama, pottery has been a very important economic resource. Pottery clay, good clay, not just for pottery, but for brick making. In fact, in most of the southern states, the good pottery clay is in the Piedmont geographic zone. But in Alabama, the pottery was made in the Tennessee Valley, on Sand Mountain, on Brindley Mountain, and even on the eastern shore of Mobile Bay, where there's high kaolin content. So yes, they had to, and really the only southern state that had an issue with pottery clay was Louisiana. Northern Louisiana had a little bit of pottery clay, so the whole market issue, but usually in the South, you were at least no more than a county away from some type of jug town where you could either be marketed to or go get pottery. Yeah, well, actually, there were quite a few jug towns in eastern Texas, and particularly Rusk County, Bastrop County, and in the San Antonio area even. So.
Last question here. Daniel Pratt.
Yes.
You may not be able to answer this question, but what did he, during the Civil War, did he continue with the cotton gin, or did he do other things there in Prattville?
Oh, he did a bunch of other things. He went. He supported the Confederacy by. I'm not sure if he retooled the factory. I think he did not make any armaments, but he outfitted in his textile factory. He had a textile factory. He outfitted a regiment. I bet there are others here who would know. So he was very involved in the war effort. I think there's a document here that Andrew Johnson ends up developing a system. Somebody will help me with the language, whereby people like Pratt could sign a document disavowing any support of the Confederacy whatsoever in order to then have the state rejoin the Union. And Daniel Pratt signs. He has a very bold signature, and it was wonderful to see that signature, knowing how much he invested in his Confederate regiment. But so yes. But I think it's also significant that many of the enslaved mechanics, his skilled slaves, who others can talk about, their different distinctions. Anyway, they remained with him and actually remained in Prattville after the war. That's not my history ends sort of somewhere in between, somewhere before the war ends. But there's literature that talks about the individuals, the first enslaved, then free black people who actually stay in Prattville after the war. So.
Thank you. One more question right here.
Also for Dr. Lakwete, you mentioned enslaved and free men working in Pratt's factory. Were there any women workers in Pratt's factory?
This was a male space. It was hard, dangerous work, and so no women. I was told by one of my professors at the University of Delaware, don't leave the women out of your story of industrialism. So they were important members of the mechanics' families, and I try to incorporate them in the book, but they were not part of these. These are, it really, when I came in the 90s to teach at the university, the Pratt factory, the Continental Gin Factory was still up and in operation, and I visited there. It was, it was a machine factory, building machines, so it wasn't a place where a woman would work.